too, right?
Correct. And
Okay.
I think, did I add? I feel like I added some things.
You did. You added the rest of it.
The rest of the chapter, yes. After we met last week, and then I added some things to chapter 8. So
yes.
So tonight we're going to go over the part of chapter 14 before it ends on 385, and just make sure that we're hitting. I've got my book over here. That's what I keep looking at.
I got my book right here.
That we're hitting everything that we need to about patient consent. And the good thing about consent is after spring break, we get into, I think, probably one of the tougher modules. It deals all with release of information. And so who can sign an authorization and who has the right to access health information. If you learn the rules of patient consent, we're going to find that those apply in that module as well. So if you get under your belt, you're already, ahead when it comes to the module that we're going to be doing after spring break. So what I've got in your module is some examples, obviously, of what these different types of consents look like. There are different kinds, and then there's initial consents, and we'll kind of break all that down. So I'm going to open up this little book kind of to get us started, and it starts, I guess, on really page 369. So, and one of the key things to take away from consents on this first page is the definition where it says it's a voluntary agreement. That's kind of the key word there, by a person who possesses sufficient mental capacity, and we're going to talk about those people, to make an intelligent choice to allow something proposed by another to be performed on himself or herself. So we learned about assault and battery in another chapter. And one of your bullet points addresses that without correct consent, it can change what a doctor does in healthcare to a non-consensual touching, which could be viewed as battery. And we don't want to do that.
It could be a tort, right?
Yeah, our doctors can get in trouble if they don't have a signed consent from the patient allowing them to be touched or perform any kind of procedures. But then, we know that's the main definition, and then we're going to undo it. In what situations does a patient not have to give consent? So, and we'll get into that. So here we know that it's got to be documented. The primary responsibility falls to the physician or nurse or other healthcare practitioner, and we're going to talk about that too. And the Medicare conditions of participation requires that the consent form remains a part of the medical record, because remember, if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. So it's no good to have a consent and have it in a pile somewhere. So it's got to be part of the record. And then Joint Commissions requires that these types of organizations, the hospitals, home care, ambulatory, and mental health, and then any other that they're accredited by, have informed consent. And we're going to break down, what informed consent is too. So
informed consent and a consent, like the consent that you consent, the consent to be treated, like I use every day at work.
Yep.
That is different from an informed consent.
It is, and we're going to talk about those, and I've got an example on the other page of what that kind of in-the-door consent looks like. It's just it's a quick consent that might be signed upon admission to allow a doctor to go ahead and treat a patient. So since you brought that up, let's go ahead and take a look at it. I'm going to go back. I wish there was a better way to get back, but there's really not. So
that's basically, those consents is basically found at a physician's office.
And at hospitals. So
and at an ED too. The ED does them.
Correct. The ED, and the doctor's offices will use them, urgent cares, anything like that. So
Right.
on the front page, we call that an initial consent form. And
Oh,
it, like I have written here, this kind of consent gets the ball rolling on treatment. And
okay.
if other procedures are needed, then we're going to be looking at informed consent. So I've got a few examples. We'll take a look. Can you see what popped up?
I don't see. I see blackness.
I think that happened last time. So you can't see what popped up.
You did, but then you got it up there. It was just upside down.
It is. It's right side up for me.
No, I said it's not up there yet. I don't see it.
Oh, okay. So let's see if this will do it. Now, can you see it?
I can see it.
All right,
yeah,
cool.
I looked at that.
Okay. So where it says, this is pretty typical for a healthcare institution to use something similar to this upon admission, and we're going to pick the emergency department, right? Because that's an easy one. People are coming in, they are wanting to have some kind of treatment, and we're talking about like a non-emergency situation, because we know emergencies from the reading have a little bit of a different policy they can follow. But you'll find this little bitty consent to treatment, and it's just enough. Somebody's here. Hang on one second. I'm going to admit whoever. It just says laptop. Hello? Hello? Hey, Elizabeth. Hey. So the consent, this little consent allows the doctor to start to treat the patient and not worry about an unconsented touching. So it's just a little tiny consent to treatment. I'm going to get some labs, some x-rays. The doctor can touch me. The nurse can take some blood. But anything that's beyond this requires an informed consent. So I'm going to go back. Oh, my goodness. I hope this works. Wait, it might be here. Let's see what that is. Okay. We back?
Yep.
All right, cool. So I'm going to go back into the chapter, and we're going to go back to page 2, what types of consents there are. All right, and so this is in your book 2 on page 369. So there's express consent, and the little consent that we just looked at in the pop-up, consent given by direct words, either orally or in writing, should be used in most situations due to liability of oral consent only. And remember, that's just a little consent that allows the doctor to go ahead and get the ball rolling on treatment. Implied consent is exactly what it sounds like. So it just says consent inferred from a patient's conduct and consent presumed in emergencies. So if I show up at the emergency room and I'm unconscious, I'm giving my implied consent, please help me. So that's all that means, okay? When a patient voluntarily submits to a procedure without, I'm going to move us. I'm going to see if I can get us out of the way. There we go. When a patient voluntarily submits to a procedure without apparent knowledge of the nature, the courts will usually find implied consent. And then it talks about other things with implied consent. So think about being at the doctor's office, and usually your doctor is going to have that initial consent that we talked about on the homepage. But when you extend your arm for a vaccination or for blood pressure or to get your finger pricked, you're giving your implied consent. Yes, please give me the immunization that I need. I'm holding my arm out to do it. Does that make sense? So you're implying through your actions that you want a specific kind of thing done. And so the bullet says it's implied in medical emergencies, which makes total sense. unless the healthcare provider has reason to believe the consent would be refused. Otherwise, and in parentheses, it says prior history of refusal. So if you have a patient that showed up and for religious reasons, they said, I don't want any blood products. So that's an easy one. That might be a religious constraint. Just because the patient is unconscious doesn't mean that the doctor should override the prior history of refusal. So if your facility knows that you've got a patient that's come in and they're unconscious and they typically say no to a procedure, you've got to honor it. So, which is really hard. And then likewise, with implied consent. So let's say you have a patient that is on the table and they're having an operation. And so here where it says, it may occur when extensions or modifications to a surgical procedure takes place. So if you've got someone on the table that is there for, let's pick a gallbladder, right? So they're there to get their gallbladder removed, and then all of a sudden they start having heart issues. They call the cardiac thoracic surgeon in. He does a heart massage. That's not going to be in the informed consent, right? So the informed consent would have been about the gallbladder, but implied consent can count in that case because it's a life-saving measure. And so likewise, when it turns to a life-saving measure, it's going to transfer to another practitioner also. And when we look at, informed consent next, that'll probably make a little more sense. But with implied consent, there's a little latitude where emergencies are concerned, typically. All right, so informed consent's the biggie. Pretty much with informed consent, you are making sure that your patients know every single thing that's getting ready to happen to them as far as a procedure is concerned. So it says, the process in which a patient is apprised of a procedure's risk and benefits and freely consents to undergo the proposed treatment or surgery. And they just can't sign the form. So the doctor can't hand them the form and say, sign it. They've got to disclose everything you see in these bullets, right? So they've got to talk to the patient. And here's the kicker, in terms the patient understands. Now, I'm sure y'all had communications with doctors too, but we're trying to talk to our patients on a level where they're understanding what we're saying. I mean, using correct medical terms when we can, but they've really got to understand the diagnosis, what the physician believes is wrong with them, the nature and purpose of the proposed treatment, all the risk and the consequences, and then the doctor's best guess on how the proposed treatment will be successful. And here's the other one, any feasible treatment alternatives. And I think that raises some eyebrows for people because they're thinking, wait a minute, I was there with my doctor and they didn't give me treatment alternatives. Sometimes you're going to find that one may be a little harder for practitioners to do because it may end up being holistic treatment or a deviation from a treatment that they want you to take, but it's their responsibility to disclose that. Alternatives and prognosis if the treatment is not given. So if the patient is adamant, I don't want this treatment, I'm not signing the informed consent, then it's the doctor's responsibility to talk to them about, okay, X is going to happen if you don't do this, whether it's surgery or chemo or radiation or whatever the treatment is. The patient has to know what they're looking at if they don't get the treatment. And then, that last bullet is anything the provider knows, and I call that kind of the kitchen sink bullet. I mean, he or she needs to tell the patients that they're talking to about what they know, their success rate, anything else that they know about this particular type of treatment. And you've got some exceptions to informed consent because, informed consent is a very lengthy procedure. And I think I have some examples on the homepage. We'll look at that. And you can look back at initial and see that was just a paragraph. And informed consent can be a page or two, and it prompts physicians to explain all of the bullets to their patients. So the exceptions are emergencies, which we've already talked about, because it's hard to give a patient informed consent in an emergency situation. And then there's a doctrine called therapeutic privilege, and that allows patients to withhold information if they tell the patient the information, it can severely affect their emotional state, and then they're unable to really understand any benefits or risks. So what does that mean? That means that the patient is in such capacity after receiving a diagnosis that they're not able to kind of process everything with an informed consent. But the doctor is still having that conversation with someone, maybe a next of kin or a loved one, but that therapeutic privilege allows the doctor to say, you're too fragile, or especially in behavioral health scenarios where the patient still may be that, the person that is responsible for signing their own consent forms, the doctor can decide this patient is way too sick. They can't really handle what I'm getting ready to tell them. And then we talk about waivers and treatments of criminal suspects or patients in custody, and they just kind of waive their rights at that point, and each individual state governs what happens to criminal suspects and patients in custody. Does that make a little sense about informed consent?
Mhm.
And we'll go back and look at it on the homepage too. So let's see what we've got next. And that, let's see, informed consent is on page 370. Let's see here. And so my notes go a little out of order because implied consent is on 371. I like to jump around a little bit. So it's a little out of order in my notes, but that's how it's in your book. Okay, so
I read it already.
This is what I said earlier about if you learn about who can give consent in this module, you've already learned some important things for the next module. And so kind of getting under your belt who can and can't sign for procedures is really important, right? Because we certainly don't want the facility to be sued based on the fact that they've had the wrong person actually give consent for a procedure that they weren't really eligible to give consent for. So the easiest person to give consent is a competent adult. And let's just say, we're going to just say as your baseline, unless a court has said that a patient is incompetent, they're competent, which is crazy, right? You guys, like Aunt Betty may be out of her mind. You might think she's got a little bit of dementia or whatever, but if the courts haven't said that Aunt Betty, isn't incompetent, she's competent. And so if she's of right mind, she's of the age of majority, then she can give her own consent. And the age of majority in the state of North Carolina is 18. So they become adults at the age of 18. And we're going to talk about minors in just a minute. Kids that have been emancipated, and we'll talk about them too. An adult is competent, right here, the third kind of bullet. An adult is competent as long as the court has not declared the person incompetent. And again, we need some paperwork. So if a son or a daughter came in and they wanted to help their loved one make a decision, sometimes next of kin can be there to help guide, but to actually sign the consent form, it's going to have to be that competent adult. And then an adult is considered competent as long as the person is capable of understanding the consequences. So all those bullets in that informed consent, and they can choose and act accordingly based on what they're hearing from the physician about, the risk and the alternatives and all that kind of good stuff. They're considered competent. And then all assessments of a patient should be documented in the record, which makes total sense because let's say your doctor wants to use or actually wants to use that therapeutic privilege where they would prefer not to have the full conversation with the patient because they just don't think emotionally they're sound enough. He's got to have that assessment in the chart so the patient doesn't come back later and be like, whoa, you did all this to me and I didn't consent to it. So what happens now? So you've got to make sure you have all that in the record to show that it was done. So like I said, the easiest person is a competent adult. Age of majority, emancipated, got some paperwork. Sounds like we're talking about dogs, right? But we're not. It's you got to have your competent adult. And if they're not competent, we need some paperwork. It's pretty easy. So incompetent adults, when they're declared incompetent by courts, then they get a legal guardian. And that legal guardian is then pretty much responsible for all the consents at that point. And then some patients are never actually declared incompetent by an actual court. And then the next of kin is assumed the guardian. And then individual states will have some statutes or laws that help hospitals figure out who's the right person to sign the consent form. North Carolina is pretty hard and fast. Competent, incompetent. If incompetence is temporary, the procedure should be delayed unless postponement presents a substantial risk to the patient. So let's say you have a patient that has had a stroke, and that patient has been declared incompetent right now from the effects of the stroke. But the belief is, okay, we're going to go through these treatment regimens, and then the patient can have any kind of particular procedure that they may have had before they had their stroke. And then, of course, organ donations have their own special set of rules. So we're not going to worry about organ donations right now. All right, so when we're talking about minors, they get a little tricky. And in the case of minors, you're always wanting the parent or guardian to consent. Unless, and these 3 bullets are important, the patient requires emergency treatment, and we already know that. Emergencies pretty much trump anything that you need in writing. The second bullet says a statute grants the minor to consent. And so the state of North Carolina and other states provide for certain types of diagnoses where children can seek treatment and they don't have to tell their parents. And so the 2 big ones are pregnancy and behavioral and mental health services that deal with drug and alcohol abuse. Okay, so if we've got a minor that shows up to our facility and we find out they're pregnant, at that point we talk to the minor about that condition, unless the minor signs a sheet of paper that allows us to talk to the parents or actually kind of hands over care to the parent. Otherwise, even if the parent is paying for the insurance, which is really difficult for parents sometimes, they don't have access to anything that deals with that diagnosis, any procedures, anything. And the same goes with behavioral health and alcohol and drug abuse. Kids can seek treatment on their own and be treated like adults. And the third bullet says a court or other legal authority grants consent, and that means emergency care. And you guys have probably seen in the news where a parent wanted a certain kind of treatment, or the physician wanted a certain kind of treatment. The parent didn't want the child to have the treatment for whatever reason, religious constraints or whatever else is going on in their life. So the doctor petitions to the court for the court to allow the facility to do it. And then we talk about emergency care. Emancipated minors is a process that a child goes through, and there's no other way to describe it than kind of divorce their parents, right? So the emancipation process takes them from a minor to an emancipated minor or to an adult. So if a 16-year-old is trying to separate from their parents, they can become emancipated, and then in that particular state, they're viewed as the age of majority, which allows them to go ahead and make their own decisions. Let's see here, mature minors. Some states have statutes that will allow older minors to consent to treatments for communicable diseases, substance abuse. We talked a little about that, but North Carolina is pretty direct. It doesn't necessarily have to be an older minor. They actually list out the types of diagnoses a child can seek treatment for. And then for minors, one of the main ways that they're going to get consent is through the parent or guardian, right? And then the only other time it gets a little sticky is if the parents are divorced, and then if there are custody issues. And so again, we're relying on paperwork from the family. We're also looking back at the history of who signed consent forms in our system. Also if we've got paperwork on file that talks about custody and who's got primary custody. But in the absence of that, if they're the birth mother or father, they can consent to treatment. So they have the right to do so. Our state gives them the right. Any questions about that page? Who can give consent?
Well,
That's why I took out the last half of this chapter. There's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of stuff here. Let's see.
can you go back over
Oops, sorry. Yeah.
mature minors?
Yeah. So mature minors, it is, and I think your book talks about mature minors, and I put it in here because some states do have those statutes, and but North Carolina doesn't. They don't say, okay, if you are a pregnant 14-year-old, your parents have to handle your care, whereas if you were a pregnant 17-year-old, you can direct your own care. So some states say in this age range, usually 16, 17, 18, before 18, 15, 16, 17, older minors can, based on the fact of their age, can direct their care when it comes to substance abuse, communicable diseases, and pregnancy. Whereas, that's what some states call it, mature minors, based on the type of diagnosis they have. Their state sees them now as mature enough to seek their own care and make decisions, pretty much. So that's what that means. Good question.
All right.
All right, so documentation. Let's see if I missed anything in here. Your book goes over a lot as far as consent is concerned, who may consent, competent patients, and it talks about guardianship, emancipated minors, incompetent patients. So all that's in your textbook before you get to page 385. I added a little bit of information about documentation, just so we know the rules, right? And you might remember this from Shannon's class when she talked about consents, but it's just they're no surprise really that after you sign the consent, it needs to be placed on the chart. Some facilities are going to require their practitioners in the notes section to write a note referencing the informed consent, because mistakes happen, y'all. So with these consent forms, if the facility is still paper-based, you still have to get that sheet of paper to a scanner to get it in the EHR. If we're not using a tablet for our patient to sign on, we still have to have a way to get that paper into the EHR. So by writing a note, in the general notes, at least it covers the physician, and your physician really did have a conversation with the patient.
You say reference a note by writing it in there. What's an example of referencing a clinician?
What a clinician may write in there is, okay, February 20th at 7:30, I informed Mrs. Watson about X, all relating to her knee replacement that will occur at 9 o'clock tonight. I discussed blah, 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 blah. She had no questions. And even though the patient doesn't, the patient's not going to sign that, the doctor's going to sign that note. But if the consent form never makes it to the chart, at least the doctor has a note in there to prove that he actually did the informed consent. Okay. It's more to cover themselves.
Gotcha.
Okie dokie. So there are a couple of different types of consent forms, short forms or general consent forms or initial consent forms. Like we talked about when we looked at it, it's going to protect your facility from battery claims. It gets the ball rolling in treatment, and it just, kind of allows people in the facility to touch you at that point. So long forms, detailed description of the patient's condition, think informed consent, proposed procedure, risks, consequences, alternatives, and And then as far as research and mandates by statutes, they can be longer because there are specific things that have to be covered in those types of consents.
Yeah.
And it says information can be handwritten or pre-printed. And typically with these, y'all, they're going to be printed, but the doctor may make some notes for the patients. That's where the handwritten type of stuff comes in. So I don't want you to think we're using any kind of weird handwritten consent forms. You know, that's just pretty much for notes.
Okay.
And then back on the front page, so you saw the initial consent form, right? We talked about here that they're signing that on the way in the door, keeps a battery claim from happening. And then I've given you a surgical consent form, just some things that larger types of diagnoses, what the American Cancer Society says about informed consent, kind of their take on it. Implied consent, what does that deal with HIPAA? What does North Carolina say about informed consent? So I'm just going to see. I don't think you see a box until I share it, right? I'm going to pick that one.
Okay.
Do you see it?
I read the case. Mm-hmm. This is the North Carolina informed consent, right?
Yep. It says informed consent to healthcare treatment or procedure. No recovery shall be allowed against any healthcare provider upon the grounds that the healthcare treatment was rendered without informed consent of the patient or other person authorized to give consent for the patient where, and then it lists it out. So they're trying to help physicians here to understand what they can do and they can't do as far as who can give consent, as far as informed consent is concerned. And I don't need you to know that. You know, I'm not going to test. It's more when I give you things that are North Carolina specific, it makes you a better employee in the state of North Carolina. You know, so if there's anything next module after spring break, there are going to be some specific things in the general statutes that I'm going to want you to know. But this one is pretty much more for information. Let's see what this one is. Oh, I just embedded it there. What do y'all see right now? Blank screen?
No, I see this.
You can see it?
I can see it.
Okay. I just embedded it there in case other people couldn't see it. Okay. So that's what the state says. And then there is a research example too, which, you know, kind of when you lay the surgical one beside the research one, you see, you know, the big difference between the two of those. And it's usually length because there's so much more going on with research. What questions do you have?
But every state's different, right?
Yeah.
What I mean, like North Carolina says, like the husband can consent for the wife. But when you read in the book, like some people were being sued because the husband said, yeah, go ahead and give her the blood so she don't die.
Yeah. Yes.
And then the wife recovers and wants to sue the doctor or the hospital. Like,
yep. So here's what's fun about the state of North Carolina and marriage. They, you know, you are married until the state says you're not. Even if you haven't been living, you know, if you haven't been living with your loved one and you consider yourself separated and y'all are divorced, guess what? The state still sees you as married. So as far as consents are concerned and releases of information, like we'll talk about in the next module, you know, when we're deciding, like you said, what you read in the chapter, who can do what, you know, if you don't love them, you need to leave them legally is what I say. You know, you gotta get that paperwork because the separation piece, usually, if there's been no formal separation, there's been nothing filed with the court systems, the court of law will still see you as a married couple. And so in the absence of anything else, that is a legal document that keeps that person from making decisions on your behalf, the state's going to rule in that case, that, well, it was the spouse, and the spouse has the authorization to give consent. So bad consent, especially if they knew that their loved one probably wouldn't want that procedure, but in any event, still consent. So that's exactly right. Ooh, it's sticky. It's sticky when it comes to marriage.
Oh, yeah.
That's a great question, though. Any other questions?
I'm good.
You're good?
Yeah.
Anna, how you feeling?
I'm good. I'm
Okay.
glad that I don't got to read past patients' rights.
Yeah. Like I said, I started looking at it yesterday because I was going to add some more stuff to the book, and I thought, oh,
What's wrong?
it's just a lot of stuff, with chapter 8, chapter 14, and I'm adding another chapter next week. So I just thought I'm going to stick patient rights back in the last module where I normally teach it. I made that decision today. I thought, I'm not going to teach it here. We'll teach it in the last module where it's been forever. So I was telling Anna Elizabeth that this new update to the textbook, they put patient rights with consent, and it was its own chapter for all the other editions. And then I looked at it and thought, yeah, we can probably do it here. But then when I really started looking at all the extra content, I thought, dang, that's a lot for, chapter 8's a big chapter. So anyhow. All right, guys. Well, if you don't have any other questions, then we'll probably finish this, and then if you got any other questions, just give me a holler. I'm glad you logged in tonight. I enjoy seeing y'all.
Well, you too.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you took the time out to
doing
do it.
Yeah, no problem. I love doing it. I miss seeing y'all in the classroom. So we'll catch you next time.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, y'all have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.